So I'm going to show you how to make an ESP32 CAM for the Flipper Zero today. I'm going to need the actual ESP32 CAM module, prototype board, 4 pieces of wire. I used the silicone wire, some header pins, and we're going to make it into something like this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut the board down to size. I'll just buy a multi-pack of the prototype board. So it comes with a variety of sizes, which is very handy. I'll put the link in the description. So the minimum size we need is 70 millimeters across and 30 millimeters high. So anything that's bigger than that you can use, and we just cut it down to size. So you could use the 50 by 70 as well, but to save the actual material, you're best off using the 30 by 70. So I've marked out where you would like to essentially cut. So if you can see where I've put the permanent marker, that's where you want to cut. And if you put the actual module on the board, it's going to look like that. So as you can see, the permanent marker where we're going to cut is just outlining the actual module and where the header pins will go. What I did to actually cut the board is I've used this, what is it? MaAnt D2, and it's just got this little cutting wheel. If I can try to zoom in. So yeah, it's got this little cutting wheel, and I've just used that. I won't actually show you cutting it and sanding it because it takes a while. So, but these are really handy if you do a bit of electronics. So you can get different attachments to put on there as well. Essentially what I've done is I've just gone through and just cut along, and then just gone and cut along that way, and then I've also flipped it around to cut, because it only cuts halfway through each time. So I go one side, the other side. Just be careful if you're going to cut this with scissors or snips or anything, because it's a joint. So if you're going to cut it, you'd want to drill a hole. Essentially, probably you want to drill a hole around here as a relief, so when you cut it down this way, it stops at the hole, and the same thing that going that way. But yeah, you're best off using like a hacksaw or something like that, or a little Dremel with a cut saw. And this is optional. You can drill a little hole here. Essentially what this will do is, once we put the camera module on, it would just give a hole so you can press the actual reset button, but you don't need it. So essentially you should be able to just use some tweezers to get in behind it to press the reset button, and you don't need to use the reset button much, so it's only essentially for the programming. So once you've cut the board, which I've already done, it'll look something like this. So you want to replicate that. So what I've done is I've actually sanded down the bottom section as well. So that whole section has been sanded down close to the hole, and the same thing with the top. So just sand it down, and you'll see there it's quite close to the hole on both sides. I'm going to test fit the actual module on there now, and you see it sits quite nicely. And look at that on the back. If you want to make it look nice, you'd spend your time, sand the corners so it's nice and round as well, a bit curved. And same here. Just so there's no sharp edges in it. It gives it a nice finished look. The next thing you want to do is, we've got to make some header pins for it. So they're 90-degree header pins. If you're using these, just the straight standard header pins, what we just have to do is essentially just get some pliers. Just hold it close to the edge and just bend it just until it's 90 degrees. You don't want to bend it too far, because then if you bend it too far, what happens is you'll end up pulling this out there as well. So when you bend that too far, if it goes beyond 90, it hits the plastic, it'll essentially just pull it up, so they won't be the same length across. So just be careful, make sure it's only 90 degrees, and just do that for all of them. So there'll be two sets of header pins. There'll be a set of 8 and then a set of 10. So just keep in mind that this one here that we're doing now, if we're using the standard header pins, it won't fit the silicone case. So essentially just 90 degrees, and all that's going to do is just going to go and sit like that, and it sits quite nicely flat. Just make sure the main thing is you want to try and make those as level as possible, so you don't want to bend the pins too much and puts them out of the height a little bit out of whack. So you essentially want a set for the 8 and a set of 10. So they'll go like that. And that's the reason why I've sort of sanded down the bottom section as well, along here. So if we didn't sand it down, you'd have a section that would be too high. You want the actual header pin plastic to be protruding past the actual prototype board, so when you put it onto the flipper, it'll actually sit a lot better. And that's why this won't fit. I don't know if it will fit the silicone case as well, just because you probably want a bit more of the plastic. So if you've got the silicone cases, you'd probably want to use a longer header pin, which I've done before. So I've got these 20mm header pins, and if you want to use the silicone case and you've got longer header pins, you can do the same thing and make it a 90-degree bend. But what I'd like to do is you can just pull out the actual header pins first. So pull them all out. And if you've got somewhere to put, like, if you've got like an Arduino shield or anything that's got the female plug, you can use that as the template of the height that you need. So you just get the plastic bits, get 2 of them, and just put them on top of each other, and then you can just put the the pin through, and just make sure it goes all the way down the bottom. So what this does is it'll set the height that we need when we push it into the flipper, so it's not too long and it's not too short. So I have something like that. So you've got 2 pieces of plastic. that's just going to space it, so when it sits onto the prototype board, it's going to sit down further, and then you can just bend it to 90 degrees. Same thing, you just want to make sure you're just bending it 90 degrees, and they're all about the same, and not too much. It's just about getting the consistent bend. These ones won't be very good because I'm sort of rushing it just to show how to do it. So then you'll have something that looks like that. So you see it has a bit more spacing there. So when you put it onto, say, the prototype board, tricky. That's why you've got to make sure that when you bend it, they're all about the same. And what that's going to do is essentially it's going to give it a bit more of a depth there. You'd probably still want to sand a little bit on the actual board as well, just so it's enough to clear the silicone. I don't have a silicone case, so I don't know how much you need to sand, but you just want to have it so it's got enough clearance. Otherwise you can just make it the same way as this. So this is the one we're doing, and it's going to fit the Flipper Zero without the silicone cases. Next step, we want to prepare the camera module. What we have to do for this is we want to take out the 5V and ground pins. So just clamp that on. Just because it's still got the black plastic on it, on the back, we just want to make sure it's heated up enough before we pull it out. So if you just heat up the pin, which should also help melt the plastic at the back of it, and you should be able to just pull it out. So just do that for the 5V and the ground pin. So heat it up. Try not to put your pliers or anything on it because it'll take the heat away. Touched it with the pliers so it's cooled it down a bit. So just add a bit more solder to it. Heat it up, and then once it's hot, pull it out. So like that. What we want to do is just snap off the plastic. So just get some pliers, or you can just use your fingers, and you should just be able to just bend it and it'll break it off. So I'm just going to use a solder sucker to get the solder out. I always like to put a little bit extra solder on top before using the solder sucker. It just helps the whole process work a bit better. Just put the solder sucker on, heat up the solder. And there you go. Let's do 2 holes, so just do the ground hole now. Solder sucker on the bottom. And 2 clean holes. This is the solder sucker I'm using. If you're interested, it's really good. Especially helps with this silicone tip with the air seal, so it just puts it right underneath. And you can get different, you can put different lengths on if you want to reach into more tighter spaces or anything like that. I'll put a link in the description if you want to purchase one of those as well. So the next step we want to do is we want to try remove this black plastic at the back. The reason we want to try and move it is because if we leave it in place, it's going to be difficult to get a good fit and have it even on both sides, because the wires can get a little bit snagged on that side there. So I can just use some tweezers or use some small screwdrivers, flathead screwdriver. And just carefully pry up the plastic spacer. Just take your time. And it'll slowly come off. So we've got that there. We can then snap off the three of them, so you're only left with 5. So just snap it off, and we can put that back on. So just make sure that when we put it on, you put it on to the last 5. So it looks like closest to the camera side is what we're putting on. Just squeeze that back on. So just like that. The next step is quite important, so make sure we have it the correct way. This is actually take 2 because I put it in the wrong way, so make sure you pay close attention. So what we want to do is put the module to the board, and we want to make sure that we have 5 spacings on this side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And on the other side, there should be 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's just zoom in again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So make sure it's like that. Otherwise, you have to redo the whole thing, which is what I'm doing now. So we've got the 10 header pins on one side, and then 8 goes on this side. So we'll just strip some wire now. I recommend using some silicone wire. It makes your job so much easier. So you can strip it with your fingers. Same as my other videos, leave a bit extra because we're going to put those through the holes. So just on one side only. And it's quite a simple module to wire in. There's only 4 connections. So we'll do the 8-pin side first. It's going to be essentially just going to be pin 1, which is the ground, and then it's going to be pin 8, which is, it's going to be pin 1, which is 5 volts, and then pin 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is the ground. So just thread the wires through. So 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And just double check. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Good. Then we just want to get the header pins for the 8 and just push it in. Just make sure it's sitting properly and sitting flush against the board. Which is good. We can then just trim off the wires on the back. Just make sure you don't let go of the board. Clamp it in. Just solder in, one side at a time. And just make sure that the wires are still in place, which they are. That's good. And just make sure it's also sitting flush against the board. Then we can just solder the rest in. And just make sure you get some good solder. It makes your job a lot easier and you'll get a nice finish. If you use some of the crappy solder, it's just a pain to deal with and it won't look as nice. I'll link to the solder that I'm using as well in the description. Just like to leave nice little beads on the back. And that's one side done. So we'll move on to do the 10 header pin side. What this corresponds to on the flipper is we've got the pin 13 and pin 14 is the pins we need. So TX will go to the UOR on the ESP32 CAM. Pin 14 will go to the UOT So we just want to put the wires in to pin 13 and 14. So easiest way to do that is if we count 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we have 4 from the back on this side, so go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then pin and then 5 and 6 is where we'll have the wires. And we put the header pins in. So just make sure the shielding of the wires is pulled back a bit away from the hole. Like that. So once it clamps in, it doesn't get the silicone doesn't get squished, and sitting nicely, which is good. And just double check to make sure that we put in the right hole. So this is pin 9. So 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14, which is correct. So 13 and 14. So you can just turn that around. Snip the wires. Actually, leave the wires on first. So we'll solder the outside pins on, and then we can trim the wire once that's set. Just make sure it's still sitting okay. Which it is. And then we can just trim the wires off. And just make sure the wires are held in place as well, just so they don't move. And just trim it flush. Solder the ones that have the wires in it, remember. And we have something like that. So we can just test fit the module into the base when it sits nicely. So as you can see, we've taken out the 2 pins. They would have hit against these header pins there. So we needed to take it out to get the spacing correct. And once it's done, it should sandwich in nicely. So it should look like that. We can now put the wires into the corresponding pins for the TX and RX. So pin 13 goes to the UOR. So UOR, that one there. And then pin 14 goes to the UOT. So I just want to see where it corresponds to on the board for those two. So I can just get a permanent marker to mark it so I don't get the wrong hole. So that's the UOR and the UOT. So pin 13 will go to the first hole that we've marked. So when we're running the wire, we want to run it within the first two, like straight up pretty much. So you go straight up and then straight across. So we just do a rough. So it's going to look something like that. So I can just strip the wire. Close to that hole, yep. Because they're right next to each other, just use that as the guide and just do it a little bit shorter. Okay, so we put the wires through the holes. So the first wire, go to the first hole. So something like that. But as you can see, this one's, the first wire's still a bit long. So I'm going to trim it down because it's just poking out the smallest bit. So just take a little bit more of the silicone off. And retry. And it sits a lot better. Next thing we're going to do is strip the wires for the power and for the ground. As you can see, like when we put it in place, it essentially lines up to the ground, lines up directly underneath the ground, so that's just going to go straight up. And the 5 volts is just going to line up to the next hole, so we can use that as the guide. So if we go pull that across, and it's going to go up a bit. So I can pull it and strip it just above the last pin. So pin 7 is the guide that we want to strip from that length. So something like that. For the ground pin, you can just strip it, give it maybe 5 mil or whatever you can, closest as possible. About that much. And then you can just strip the rest off. Just line up the wires again. Next thing we're going to do is going to thread the wire through to the right hole. So the first wire, pin 1, will go to the 5 volt. And then the second wire will go to the ground. And they should line up pretty much directly on top of it. Like that. You can see. So put the wires through. Next we want to try to slowly make sure that we've sandwiched the back wires in as well. So I use some tweezers to pull it into the right direction. And just line up the front pins. If we do it carefully enough and make sure the wires in between don't hit anything, they should just clear everything. And you should be able to push it down and it should sandwich quite nicely. The goal that we want to do is we want to get it squished enough that it's going to essentially touch the metal shield on the ESP32 CAM to the prototype board. So we can clamp that in place. So yeah, make sure that it's sitting flat on the actual shielding. So if you hold it around here into the bottom, that's where you want to clamp it. So clamp onto that side once it's sitting flush against the prototype board to the shield. Then we can solder it in. So we'll start with the two closest to the right hand side. So just do that one. So trim it flush, trim all the pins flush. Just making sure it's at the right height. Yep. So I'll start soldering it in. So yeah, just do the first two closest to the right side. Then we just want to make sure it's sitting right still. And then just do the holes, the ones next to that one, and I just slowly work away across. Still looks good. Yep. So we soldered all the back ones in. The bottom row will have every hole soldered, which looks nice, and the top's just got those ones there. It's quite a nice clean look. The last thing that we're doing is just going to solder the power and the ground to the ESP32 CAM. So pull it up, pull the wires up, give it a nice trim close to the board, Just make sure the wire doesn't fall through. Careful not to push the wire through. You can solder it in before you cut it as well. I just like to do this as it gives it a bit of a cleaner look. That's it there, done. I'll show you how to flash the firmware onto it as well. So you have MAYHEM firmware. So just connect it up. And you can just clean it up with some alcohols or get rid of some of that flux. So to flash the firmware onto the ESP32 CAM, we'll need to jump the I00 and the ground pin together. So you just need to get something to touch those two together. And we also need to press the reset button. So the reset button is just behind here. If you've drilled a hole, you can just poke something in, or I've just got tweezers, I can just press. So the process is, go to GPIO, USB UART bridge, just make sure it's connected. Then we want to it's a bit hard when I'm trying to film, but essentially what we want to do is jump these, the 100 ground, click on the reset. Once you click on the reset, let go, and then let go of that. So jump these two, hit reset, let go reset, let go of that. So I'll try to do it now. If I can line it up. So jump these two, press reset, let go, let go. And that should put it into the boot mode. If you go to the page that I've linked, it will take you to the firmware, how to flash the firmware. So we've gone onto there, go into install, click on the actual flipper, connect, and then we can go install. Maybe. And there you go, it's writing. So once we've finished the writing process, we should be good to go and use it. But yeah, you just want to get that that step right when you're putting into the flash mode. Hold the I00 and ground together. Quickly press the reset and then let go of the I00 and ground right after it, and it'll get you right into the flashing mode. It might take you a couple times. I think I was just lucky to get it there. It's just the right timing. So join the two connections together, press reset, let go, and then let go of the connections as well. So yeah, this firmware by Erwin Reed is really good. So it's just MAYHEM for the Flipper Zero. He also sells the MAYHEM boards. He's just coming out with the V2. So check him out if you want to buy one of his boards, and just he's done some great work. So it's all done. All done. So I can just disconnect the cable, get it out of there, pull the board off just to reset it, put it back in, and we can test it out. So if we go to the apps, I've got Extreme firmware installed in my Flipper, so it already comes with the MAYHEM apps, or you can just install it through the link that I've provided as well. So it's just part of that install page. It has links to the actual FAT files if you want to install onto your Flipper. So and we'll just test out a few of them. I'll go through all of them. So you get a MAYHEM camera, and that's just a camera, which is cool. Evil Portal. It's not going to work on mine because I haven't actually installed the... Oh, well, there you go. So that's that. Got Marauder. Morse flasher. But yeah, you can have a play around with all the other different MAYHEM apps. Big shout out to Erwin Reed again for compiling the firmware. And check if you want one of his boards. Have a look. Search on Google for MAYHEM board for Flipper Zero, and you should be able to find a link to it. And if you want to purchase one, you can purchase one. So his board will have you've got the ESP32 CAM, and it's also got like attachments for the CC1101 and also the NRF24 as a one package. So I actually made my first multi-board last night. So it's essentially the ESP32 CAM that we've just made, but it's also got a header pin, 8 header pin attachment, and a switch to turn it on and off for the power. So I can now put a attachment on the back as well and have that work. So it's my version of, I guess, the MAYHEM board. But yeah, I won't really show how to do this one because it's quite difficult. But hopefully I've given you the foundation to make your own if you want to go down that path. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.